Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Kurt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 27 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast, Free Will and Trauma. So today is a podcast I've really been looking forward to since I think the first time I ever met Kurt. We had a real fun conversation about this topic, and I've been dying to get to it ever since. So this was originally scheduled to be our episode 26, 6-month, a fun topic. And yeah, with everything going on in the trauma-informed care world, we decided to move this one back a week. So should have a lot of fun. And it's actually should be a really important topic because I think we just sort of assume people are making logical choices when sometimes might not be doing that so much. So I think there's a lot to learn and a lot of fun to be had. So Kurt, Jerry, good to see you, my friends. We were talking a little beforehand as being a Hoosier son of a basketball coach and the craziness of the NCAA tournament going on. And I was sharing I don't fill out brackets anymore because I just want to root for like teams I've never even heard of, like University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So I guess that exists. So, and they beat Virginia. So if you've been watching that, a basketball fan, I bet you've been having fun with us as well. So
none of us knew that Wooshock was the mascot for Wichita State until about 4 years ago.
And we won't have to see that ugly
Wichita State fans out there.
Yeah, we want to see that ugly corn cob for a while. So they even had a rough start when Cinderella becomes the favorites, and then they get beat by a team we don't hear of. So always fun to have some madness and enjoy that. So to get us started today, let's get those bright, shiny objects in. So Jerry, what about you, my friend? What are you thinking about this week?
You know, I guess this week I want to kind of give a shout out to school counselors. I've been running this consulting group for schools around the state of Colorado. And with the limited mental health services in schools, a lot falls on school counselors, social workers to kind of meet the needs of traumatized children in schools without a great deal of support sometimes. And I've really been impressed with the commitment and dedication and in some ways grit of some of these to be able to fight to get the children's needs taken care of and met. And so this week, I'd just like to kind of recognize some of the work that's going on in the schools, not so much in the classrooms, but outside the classrooms to support the mental health of children in schools. And they need a lot more support, especially with lots going on in our nation now.
Absolutely. And you see that. I mean, if we're really going to take trauma sensitive schools seriously, that mental health support is such a missing component in so many schools right now. And so absolutely. And the ones that are doing it are often like at multiple schools, which boy, burnout can really seep in when you know each school needs more than you may be able to offer. So I think Kurt and I would just second that big time. So Kurt, what about you, my friend?
Thinking about kind of what we talked about last week with Bruce Perry going on Oprah and the 60-minute special and everything, I've been stricken a little bit by how much I've heard the words trauma-informed movement be used in the last week, you know? And I'm kind of looking around going, I didn't know I was a part of a movement. I guess I am, but I didn't know. So it's pretty fun to kind of look around and see, not just in the local community, which I get to see a lot of people in the local community really interested in learning about how we can interact with children and families differently and how we can do it better. And so also to see that on a national scale and even on an international scale was pretty fun over about the last week. And I guess one thing that certainly for me to learn is that if you're ever talking with Matt Bennett, you're a part of a movement, whether you want to be or not.
Hey, it's fun that way. Yeah, and I would second. I mean, it's really like there was this boost. I was at a great training down Southern Colorado, and they even played the Oprah clip. It's like, well, Oprah's on our team now. We got to do something with it. So, yeah, I've obviously been pretty much milking that for all it's worth as well. So
that's kind of up your activist alley.
That will not surprise anybody. So excellent, and I second that. I just think to see some of this come out, and I think even for folks that haven't seen that, when I tell them it happened, they get excited. Even, not everybody's lucky enough to get emails from everybody whenever a new link comes out. So it's been fun to kind of share that as well. So I'll go with my bright shiny object today. Actually is happening on Saturday, and something I've been looking forward to an incredibly long time, and that's the March for Our Lives rally. Really the student movement for gun safety, and I look at it as community safety and school safety as well. So I watched the walkouts happen last week and was cheering from the sideline. I was actually in Southern Colorado when it was happening. I couldn't wait to get into the hotel room to see the news. And it was just, I know in our state you saw it happen all over the place. Sometimes it was, just a few people. Other times the whole school walked out. There was this one story that didn't get a lot of attention of a kid that the original walkout was for 17 minutes, and he sat out there for like several hours giving a minute to every victim of gun violence in schools over the last year. So there were just these really cool things pop up, and I'm excited to march. If you've never been to a march before, it's probably a good one to go to. We've got a group meeting at 13th and Lincoln in Denver, Colorado. If you want to join us I think it starts around 2. We're going to be there about 15 minutes before it starts. Russia, our guest from a couple weeks ago, is going to be joining us. So if you're just a little nervous because you've never marched in social justice, maybe you haven't been out there, and you want a free time, hey, look for the 6'7" dude on 13th and Lincoln in Denver, Colorado. So we'll organize around the height, and I think I can't wait to just put, my body, at least as far as showing up for those kids and the amazing things they've done. So been looking forward to this for a long time, and just so proud of, not just the kids, down in Florida, but I mean, that's spread throughout the country, and it's just cool to see. So I'm excited to at least show up and say, hey, even if you're not old enough to vote, you're not alone, and we'll vote for you. So looking forward to that this Saturday. So, and that's in most communities, or hopefully a short drive away. So, and it seems like Jerry got his therapy dog. So you might need that one for this episode, my friend. So when we talk about free will and volition, which I sort of define as the expression of free will, it really goes back, and I kind of like to start it here to organize us, sort of what we began talking to with Russia. And I think whether we're talking about a criminal behavior or all kinds of other behaviors that sometimes gets folks in trouble, or just really sometimes keep them stuck in negative behavioral habits, there's this concept of free will. What happens between someone experiencing severe trauma in their life and doing an action like a criminal act, maybe getting high for the first time, which eventually leads to an addiction, and those sort of things. What happens, and are they choosing? I think that's sort of the core of this question. Are they choosing those behaviors? And what are we really looking at there? So I want to start out, like I said, I've been really looking forward to this conversation. Just kind of, Kurt, from your perspective, now that I've gotten to know you a little bit better since that initial conversation, inside, outside the skin, kind of walk me through what you think. How much, control do we have in the moment to maybe choose something very differently than we've done the day before, that sort of programmed our brain in habits or other patterns of thoughts and behaviors?
But I think one of the other difficult things to define in kind of the collection of terms that you just said is, how do we even talk about the concept of choice? Mm-hmm. What does it mean to make a choice? And in the behavioral parlance, we say that's allocating a response to one option over other options. That's how you just define a choice, essentially. And that can be a variety of things, right? That can be how I decide to say one word over any other word I could pick in any given moment. I could decide to steal bread instead of going and buying bread. All of those things could be ways that we make choices and allocate our behavior to one thing over other options. And then the related question, once we kind of get our heads wrapped around choice a little bit, is what controls how we allocate our behavior among multiple options, whether that be how we think about things, how we talk about things, how we act, what we do, what we decide not to do. All of those things come down to what are the elements that really contribute to all of those things. And certainly one of the things that I learned as a behavior analyst is that the environment has a lot to do with that. And what has happened to us in the past has a whole bunch to do with that. And so that's certainly a way that in the behavioral language, we've kind of put a lot of time and attention and research, and there's a lot of literature about that. When you pull in things about neurobiology and genetics, what we really find out is that all of those things are interacting with one another. Right? That genes allow us to have the opportunity as a species to pass along things that are important from one generation to the next generation. And some of those things can be the way that our bodies react. Some of those things can then prepare us to engage in certain responses that then get interacted with by the environment, and so get maintained over time. So there are lots of terms in there, right? And it can get philosophical really, really quickly when we talk about that. And I think, as I was kind of thinking a little bit about this episode, there are a couple of things that I've read over the years that I've kind of kept in my head that people have said better than I could ever say them, right? One of them was certainly by B.F. Skinner, who's well known as the father of behaviorism. One of the things that he said in a book that he wrote many years ago called Beyond Freedom and Dignity is that the issue really isn't whether or not we can free human beings from any control. It really is, how do we improve the ways in which they are controlled? And for me, that was a really good point when I learned a lot about the trauma-informed perspective. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And now we're talking about how do we improve relationships, because relationships, right, they have a big impact. They control behavior in a lot of ways. And certainly that's one of the things is, you read through any of the quotes and a lot of the things that Dr. Perry has written about. I mean, relationships is just a bedrock to his approach, and that relationships and the quality and quantity of relational interactions have a huge impact on how we act on any given day and in any given moment. So I've thought about that one. I think about this question a lot, and I've argued with a lot of students about it over the years. And usually it takes about 6 months until the student goes, okay, all right, I think you've made your point now enough. But yeah, that one quote about really improving the ways in which we are controlled, because really there isn't any freedom from control. It's just, how do we feel about what is controlling us? And so that certainly has been formative in my thinking over the years about whether or not we have free will or volition in essence.
Jerry, what about you? I'm flashing back to the Matrix now about the blue pill and the red pill. I'm really interested to see, where you see sort of, a case for that volition and free will exist or not.
Well, let's start with that free will isn't free, right? It's that there's so many um, forces and variables, both in the environment, externally and internally, that are determining our response to stimuli. To kind of think about that, or demands in the environment, our past history, organizing what we're paying attention to, organizing how we're going to respond. On the other hand, we can't predict how somebody's going to respond. So there must be something about the individual that determines how they're going to respond. If not, we can kind of just say there's a stimulus and there was a response, and no matter what you put in front of it, Skinner thought with his pigeons, they were very similar to people, that you just put a stimulus in front of it. So when we think about trauma, one of the underlying challenges that people have is not to respond in an automatic, repetitive, rigid way to an event that occurred in the past, right? And so if you kind of follow some of the Buddhist teachings, there is an attempt to free ourselves from those things and then to be able to respond. So somewhere between being traumatized and being the Buddha, there's free will, right? It's like, so when you have this argument, is it possible to have total free will? Well, probably, with lots of work and lots of sitting and lots of doing it. Is it possible that we're totally absent-minded and responding to stimulus in the environment? Yes, probably there are times. And my sense of it is most of us live on this continuum where there are times that we're thoughtful and we are aware of what's happening internally and aware of what's happening externally, and we make a conscious decision on how we want to respond. But for lots of the time during the day, we're kind of on autopilot, moving through and responding to stimulus, and with kind of conditioned way of seeing the world and kind of responding. And so I think this argument of trying to figure out, do we have it or we don't, I think it's a better discussion to say is, when do we have it and when do we don't? What is the conditions that we can create for ourselves that allow us to truly be able to make a volitional choice? And what are the conditions, whether it be stress or lack of resources or overwhelming environmental demands, that take away that capacity for us to stop? And given that, are there things we could do to increase our ability to such mindfulness training or whatever we're engaged in, to increase our capacity to be able to make those volitional choices? So I think it's a nice philosophical argument, and my belief is we somewhere live along that continuum.
Yeah. Well, my natural instinct is to want to go to Descartes and start a minimalist dualist argument, but boy, I'm going to fight that and throw it back to Kurt to get your response on what Jerry just said.
One of the most kind of powerful conceptual, what's the word I'm looking for? Ways of describing our world that made most sense to me in the last few years was one that I heard from a guy named Dan Gilbert, who's at Harvard. And one of the things he said that I liked—
Everybody's at Harvard.
All the smart people, apparently. The people who say really cool things, they're all at Harvard. But we can all describe the experience of visualizing something that we value and want to engage in some behavior that obtains it for us, right? Or deciding something I want in the future and I can see the path to get there. And we make a choice to go, oh yeah, I want to do that in 2 years. So I'm going to do this today and this tomorrow and this the next day. We can all describe that experience. And the way that Dan Gilbert talked about it was from an evolutionary standpoint. He said, why would it be that in a very short evolutionary period of time, the human brain has tripled in size. When that kind of thing happens, it doesn't just gain new functions, it gains new structures. And one of the structures that really came online in that last period of evolutionary time to our present is the frontal cortex. He's like, what's the big value of that, right? Why would our heads get so much bigger as a result of that? And what's the value of it? And what he said was real powerful to me. He said, what we all have in our heads is an experience simulator. Right? That we can simulate experiences and imagine what it would be like to have an experience. And what a value that is, that I don't have to go and figure out that if I stick my finger in a light socket, that's not a good idea. I can watch somebody else do it and go, yeah, I don't want to do that. That hurts. So I'm not going to do it. So I can avoid danger really effectively that way. I can also imagine what it's like to win the lottery. And that feels real good. And so I can use that experience simulator, that function that we got in our brain, and I can use it in a way that in the behavioral world, we would call it operant. I can make it voluntary. I can do it when I want to do it. And that's a part of my behavior that it's entirely inside my skin, right? Nobody can see what I'm simulating inside of my head, but I can do that. And I can do it when I want to. I can do it when I choose to. And I can learn to do it in different ways. That's one of the great things that I found about dialectical behavior therapy and mindfulness-based training, right? That's a way of taking something that is a skill and putting it under voluntary or operant control, and really powerful. The better we can use that huge, big part of our brain that evolution has equipped us with over much effort and much time, is to simulate experiences and then go, do I want that one or not? And I can create a plan for how to get there. I can ask somebody else for how to get there and figure it out without having to learn everything myself by going through each specific experience, which is really, really useful.
Yeah. So you know, I love this conversation, because you can get really nerdy about it, which I will try not to do. But the other thing too is, you know, with the neurobiology, and I find a lot of the hardcore neuroscientists and their work that I read, a lot of them are what's called materialist, which really believes you could explain most everything about human behavior and emotions and everything else by the sum of the total of what's in really not just the brain, but the entire biology. And these are smart people that I usually have to read their books like 3 times to get some grasp on what they're saying, and really brilliant. And other folks that seem to actually work with other individuals as clients in psychology or psychiatry seem to think, well, there's just a little bit more than that, because I think the 3 of us have all seen people throughout our careers, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have too, make behavioral changes that most people, including the individual who made the change, wouldn't dream that would be possible even a few years ago. And so I think why this is such an important topic is I don't think we have the science necessarily to maybe say, oh, this is the concrete answer. It's 3%, it's 30%, it's 60% of any given decision. And exactly like Jerry said, sometimes it might be 0%. Other times it might be in the 80s, 90s, or so on there. But it just really was an awakening thing to me. I lived downtown Denver when I first moved to Colorado, and I lived around the street of Colfax and Broadway. And I tell this story in a lot of my trainings. And, you know, if you know anything about homeless services and shelter care, too often we basically kick people out of shelters at 8 or 9 in the morning. So just have some empathy for that, you know, you were lucky enough to find a shelter bed that night, kicked out on the street. And so many of these folks, this was before I worked with them, before I got to know some of them professionally, is they would walk down Broadway, and there was sort of this corner. And at the time, Colfax was sort of the street that, you know, if you had enough money, you could, you know, manage your addiction or get in other kinds of maybe illegal activities. If you kept going down Broadway, it was sort of kind of represented in a very simplistic way, a positive choice, if we want to look at it that way. Down Broadway is where the library was, where Denver Health was, a lot of case management organizations, healthcare, social service organizations were down there. And I had this, and this was coming out of, again, that really great 3 years graduate education that I'm still paying off. I sort of thought that people got to the corner of Broadway and Colfax and had an existential crisis where they got there and they said, okay, how's my behavior today going to impact me going forward? Because that's kind of how I was told through cognitive behavioral therapy to kind of think about things. And what I really realized as I got into actual clinical practice and really into the research is that for them to go down Colfax and get high was like for a lot of us to brush our teeth in the morning. If you look back, probably unless somebody just remembered they forgot to brush their teeth this morning, most of us didn't wake up this morning, put a sticky note from last night on our mirror to say, hey, remember to brush your teeth. It's part of that routine. And for so many of these folks, I thought they were having this existential crisis. Their brains, because our brains are highly programmed to do what it did the day before, the day before, the day before. So if they were doing this behavior for the last 15 years, so many of them could walk through their day like we can commute to work and do something fairly complex, which is drive a car at high speeds without really engaging in that process mindfully whatsoever. So that just really gave me a much greater appreciation of, that not everybody is making this volitional existential choice in every moment. And that really helped me at least have some empathy of what these people were struggling with when they started to go from that kind of pre-contemplation or not thinking about making a major life change into that contemplation stage. And that really just, it kind of helped and grounded my thinking in the hopes that I could maybe partner with them to help them think about, instead of going down Colfax like they've done every time for the last 15 years, to maybe make a different choice, even if that choice is just one day and then they go back, but eventually, hopefully, create healthier opportunities for them as well. And I kind of wonder, like when in your, from the behavioral perspective, Jerry, your work, how do you help people sort of, even the basic, I think, is to recognize they even have a choice, which again, I've realized is not necessarily a given for a lot of people in that survival kind of traumatized state.
Yeah. I think that as you described, one of the fun things that you get to do as being a professional in this field is get to see and be a part of a lot of people making changes in their behavior and in their lifestyle. And that's really fun to be a part of when it's, when it's something that they value and they're moving towards a better future for themselves. And it's what they want. And that's always a really enjoyable process to be a part of. But that moment is really quite magical. When it happens, right? When you look back on it and you go, God, one day I just decided I don't want to do that anymore. Or I decided I want to do this instead. And so they're either getting away from something or going towards something. And when you recount that experience, it really seems like magic. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we experience it, which is really cool. But really to say that moment, we can't really predict or have much control or influence over when that moment happens is really kind of taking a lot of power away from a lot of people who are trying to engineer that moment, right? So I think one of the really good messages about the way that I've learned a behavioral approach, and that matched up really well with my learning about a trauma-informed approach, is that moment is the cumulative effect of a lot of moments leading up to it. And so that is one of the things that gives everybody involved in this process a lot of influence and a lot of power in that situation, right? I remember talking to so many of direct care staff working in residential units and in classrooms, which is a really stressful, really difficult job. And they would get really, really frustrated. And certainly, I kind of remember them telling them a story that a lot of my friends used to say to me when, they find out what I did for a living, right? And they'd be like, oh, it must be so great. You get to be a part of people changing their lives every single day. And, that must be just wonderful. And I said, you know what that job really is? The job is showing up every day. And sometimes you're in the right place at the right time. But if you don't show up every day, the probability of you being in the right place at the right time goes way down. That's the real job. Get yourself set to show up every single day and be there and try and connect with people every single day and do what you can every single day. And sometimes you're in the right place at the right time, and you get to see a little magic happen. That is the cumulative effect of all those things that you don't remember that you did for all those days you showed up. That's a real fun thing that I think about as you were talking too, that, you know, repetition is the key to learning.
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that we design our environment so that they are positive and that they are repetitive, and that the more we can do that, the more magic we get to create, right? And we won't remember all the things that we did all those days leading up to it, but there will be that day that we'll tell all the stories about when we're drinking beers later after work, you know, and everybody's like, oh, this great thing happened, and they tell the story about the magical moment.
Yeah.
Which is the effect of a lot of moments leading up to it.
Absolutely. And how awesome is it to be, you know, your life occupation and passion to be a part of that is such a cool thing. So Jerry, I got Kurt said the word magic. We got the behavioralist to say magic. So I don't know what's going to come out of your mouth at this point.
He's going to have to do the other
I'm
thing.
going to do operant conditioning.
Right. If I know Jerry, whatever I say, he's going to say the opposite.
I know. So I don't know where this is going next. But Jerry, what do you have to say?
You know what I was thinking as you were talking about your gentleman or woman that was on the corner of Colfax and Broadway is the capacity for reflection and the capacity to stop and be able to look inside and reflect on our experience to be able to make a choice about something. And the part of our brain that, in a way, due to limited resources, creates habits is very different than the part of our brain that reflects and is self-aware. And I think as my experience with people has been, when I ask them to go back and reflect on how many decisions they made before and when they were at that corner, that's part of the change process, right? Is that not that I'm asking you to make a different decision, but to reflect on, as Kurt said, all those things you did up to that moment were there, and really empowering them to know they actually made a lot of choices in that time, right? They actually made a choice to wake up. They actually made a choice to get dressed. They actually made a choice whether they brushed their teeth or they didn't brush their teeth. They actually went down and got something to eat. They went down to walk on the street. They picked a direction to go. Think of how many choices were made along that way. And I think that when we focus on the 1 second that it seemed like they didn't have any power and control, I think Kurt really alluded to that disempowers people. So that really in a way, even when we're in automatic, when I'm driving my car and I'm not even conscious, I'm making lots of decisions in that unconscious state. Mm-hmm. And so I think that as we go back, that this ability to have an ability to kind of reflect on our experience and to be able to kind of make sense of it, whether it's something in the future or something in the past, gives us an ability to make a decision, because that person will be on that corner again tomorrow. And if I go back and I look at all the decisions, somehow maybe I'm in a different state tomorrow when I wake up and I put my feet on the ground and I realize I'm putting my pants on, and that's a volitional choice I'm making to kind of do it. So we could focus on where there's not power and there's law. So I do think that this concept of what is a volitional choice and what isn't, we have the ability to, because of limited resources, to create habits for ourselves. And we do these things automatically. And some of those things are really, really productive for us. You know, learning how to drive a car and getting someplace. That's very productive in my life. But doing drugs and going down the street, that's not productive, but it's really mediated by the same brain functions kind of looking at that. So I think that it's not maladaptive to have habits. It's maladaptive what type of habits we create. So I think that when Kurt uses the word magic, I think what it's the magical part is when you're there, when that light goes on and somebody realizes I do have a choice. And you just happen to be there at that moment to kind of observe that. But I think that we all have that experience to in some ways feel like we're out of control of something. And when we stop and reflect on it, we have way more control than we originally believed we had. So again, is this philosophical issue, is it totally out of our control? Is it totally in our control? It's both. It's a dilemma, as Kurt would like to say. The dialectical dilemma.
Well, and there's some interesting research that as I was, getting into that, and those hardcore neuroscientists that are very materialistic, and I believe if I ask them, I might have to ask them 5 different ways to get them admitted. Is, hey, if we just understood everything about that glob of jelly sort of thing we call our brain, we could predict everything. That's sort of where I think some of that hardcore science is, which again, when you watch people make amazing life changes, there seems to be a little leeway there. But, one of the things I saw, and I think when we bring trauma into it, it helps me understand why folks that have that unresolved trauma, especially that complex or intense history of it, have really trouble is that, they sort of studied, and there's some fascinating ways to do this about when our brain kind of first lights up, that we're going to make an action, like even something small, like raising our hand, like really small actions. And it seems like we have like a 10th or 100th of a second to override that natural response. So, and really what overrides that in a lot of ways is the logical prefrontal cortex. The higher areas of our brain, the logical areas of our brain, have this really brief window, and it's a doable window in the terms of neurobiology to really kind of stop ourselves and stop the natural impulse. Like I said, I challenge people, all of our listeners, to catch yourself before you brush your teeth tomorrow morning. Catch yourself. Get it before you put that toothbrush in your mouth. Stop, put the toothbrush down, say, I got Matt, right? Prove me wrong. Email me. I'm fine with that. Tell me how you did it. I know that 95 to 100% of you will say, oh, bleep, I'm already done brushing my teeth when I realize Matt gave me this challenge. And so when we look at, the impact of trauma on, the prefrontal cortex or that executive functioning, when we try to think out to a different future, when we're more in that survival mode and the amygdala limbic system is overactive. And I'd love to get your guys' thoughts on this as well. Well, what I see in the research is that the parts of the brain that we would need to sort of catch ourselves from an immediate reaction that we may have repeated days and days and years maybe in the past, and say, okay, to now, instead of going down in Kofax and getting high, I'm going to go down to Denver Health and actually go to my medical appointment or check out mental health services. I see that the tragedy of all this is that, again, a brain that has that unresolved trauma is actually, there's an injury there that even prevents volition from being enacted, even more so than the struggle that we'll have trying to stop ourselves from brushing our teeth tomorrow. And I just kind of want you guys to throw in any research or findings that you've seen in your reading and research as well.
Well, I think about I think it's probably a slide a lot of us have seen a lot before, with where the brain structures and functions are organized hierarchically. It looks like a big triangle, right? In that, as the brain develops in this sequential fashion, when trauma happens, it disrupts that development. It changes the trajectory of it. And so if the brainstem develops first, right, then that's kind of the substrate upon which the limbic system is built, and that it has to get built on a good solid base. And then if that is not solid and it gets built on an unsolid base, then the next level up is also additionally, unstable. And as we go higher up that hierarchy of brain structures and functions, then we get more plasticity the higher up we go, and less plasticity the lower down we go. So if things get developed early in those stages at the brain stem, where we have regulation and where we have so many just basic functions live, then that unstable base causes more instability at the next level and can contribute to it. And that can result in, I go back all the way back to what we were talking about with Dan Gilbert, right? It can impact your ability to use your frontal cortex to both inhibit lower areas of the brain and to generate a positive future vision, right? To use it to imagine winning the lottery. That can become really kind of diminished when we have developmental trauma that happens at stages of development where everything is being built. So yeah, I think your point, I think, is right on, right? That's kind of the point of understanding development and changes in developmental trajectory as a result of exposure to ACEs.
Yeah.
Really that it impacts the chain all the way up.
Absolutely. Could you just, for our audience who may have not heard our past conversation, when you say the upper part of the brain is more plastic, the lower is less, can you just clarify that for folks that may have not caught that?
Yeah, I mean, probably the easiest way to kind of explain that is that more plasticity means that you can change things easier. Right? So the more plasticity we have, the more adjustable things are. Right? That at the cognitive level, we can make changes about how we think about things a little bit easier than we can about how we are regulated and how we feel about things. So there's less ability to adjust those things. And really what that means, it doesn't mean that you can't. It just means really that you need more repetitions of an experience to be able to do that. And so if we've established something early on, then the number of repetitions of experience is likely to be required before that changes. Before a regulatory state or trait changes, takes a lot more repetition than something where we're talking about how I think about or how I learned that 2 + 2 = 4. But I can change to 2 + 2 does not equal 4 easier than I can changing how my heart rate is really responding to my environment.
Yeah, thank you for that. Jerry, what about you? What have you seen as far as from a neurobiological perspective about how this is supported, building on what Kurt and I've said?
Well, I think Kurt summed it up fairly well. So, and I think he did it, but his thought before about I don't have to stick my finger in a light socket to understand that it's bad. The other thing is, if I do stick my finger in a light socket, I don't wait till it gets up to my amygdala. My brainstem reacts immediately and pulls my hand away because I don't have to think about that, right? And that when we're very young and we're learning things about the world, they get recorded even below the level of the amygdala. Our brainstem is immediately reflexively reacting to certain things in the environment. And then there are other things that are conditioned into our amygdala that allow us to kind of respond to even before we have conscious awareness of things, right? And so when we live in an unsafe world and we have to survival is constantly a challenge. We have to be able to respond much more rapidly to potential threats in the environment. Therefore, less resources are allocated to those parts of the brain that are going to think through and make decisions and evaluate things and come up with alternative strategies. We're much more designed to react and to respond rapidly to potential threats. So I think that when that occurs during developmentally sensitive periods, the wiring in those parts of the brain that you kind of see that connect the prefrontal cortex to that allow us to downregulate the amygdala's responses, the ability to take what's on the right side of our brain and then process it in language on the left side of our brain. All of those things that we find are, there's actually less neural connections, and they're less myelinated, so they're not as efficient. So when we think about stress, people who live in a stressed environment, their nervous systems are designed to respond rapidly, which also is they're less accurate in their response because they're not processing things. So they're going to see threat where there's not threat, and they're going to be thinking, as if you think about Dr. Perry's kind of continuum of arousal, the higher we go up on arousal, the less we're concerned with the future and more we're concerned with minutes and seconds from here. So for an individual that's standing on a corner of Colfax and Broadway, I'm thinking about what do I need to do to avoid being unsafe, and where do I need to do to feel some relief from this internal pain. I'm not thinking about the long-term consequences to my body and the fact that maybe if I spend my money, I won't have food for tonight. I'm thinking about what's happening right now, right here. And my brain is primed to think about the world that way. So there's a lot of neurobiology that would support that decision. And there's functional MRIs and other types of technologies that allowed us to kind of look at not necessarily particular regions, but the interconnective circuitries between these regions that prime us to, as trauma victims or people who live homeless or whatever, to be really primed to respond rapidly to potential threats and downregulate the thinking parts of their brain.
Yeah. And all this kind of leads me is I want to shift sort of the last part here about what we can do to help people realize that they may have some power, choice, decision-making, whatever we want to label it in their environment. But a few other things just to add there to the research I've seen. And one is a more representative analogy that I found incredibly useful to describe a whole lot of complex neurobiology, coming from Miller and Rolnick, the founders of motivational interviewing. And they say, you know, a good way to think about change is that think about there's a committee of 100 people inside your head. And if 100 people vote to go one way, you'll go down Broadway, go to the library, you'll have that. And in some ways it's majority rules, but I really saw that as really representing the stages of change, where a lot of people, and I don't think we give enough recognition to this, at least I didn't early on, are in that pre-contemplation stage, where when I walk up to Colfax and Broadway, again, there's no existential crisis going on. My biological wiring, and again, as Jerry said, my traumatic biology in many ways just has me going down there. If no other things have changed in my environment from yesterday and the day before and the day before, I'm fully programmed. In other words, I got 100% of the votes saying go get high, and I don't even have to think about it. And then they meet somebody, and this is kind of our roles as helpers, as educators, as therapists, as student counselors, as teachers, whatever roles that we're in, is then somebody comes and talks to them maybe about a drug alcohol treatment center, a class in the library. Maybe an outreach worker comes and helps them get into the clinic. And so now when you're in contemplation stage, maybe for the first time, and again, all this was incredible insight when I started learning about it. Now for the first time, they know that there is another option available. So when we judge folks of just being lazy or, you know, they just don't want a better future, they just want to live off the government, sometimes really that they've never had that contemplative moment of, do I want something else? And so, you know, that may shift the vote from 10 to go down to go to the library, but 90 are still voting to go get high. So again, the vote still loses, but we've shifted it a little bit. And then again, as conversation, as empathy, as we help someone relate and regulate, which I'm sure will be a theme of the last sort of part here, you know, we start to shift that vote more and more, where maybe it's 30-70, still 70 to get high, but they're willing to maybe go tour the drug and alcohol facility, maybe able just to go to talk to a nurse at the clinic. And over time, we shift into action stage, and there's this beautiful movement into that. And as Kurt said, you know, there's those magical moments, but there's a lot that happens 99.9% of the time to get to that moment of realization. And I loved that analogy with the stages of change. When you think about how our brain cells, these neurons, are hardwired to fire. And one of my favorite pieces of neurobiology is that on every neuron, I think it's every neuron, Jerry might know different, but on most neurons at least, there's these connections that want that neuron to fire, called excitatory connections, and there's ones that are designed to inhibit it from firing. So for me, who love Nietzsche and Sartre and all these great Kierkegaard, like, and thinks existentialism's dead in the age of neurobiology, there is this beautiful like mix, and it's not as simple as that one cell fires and then I walk down Koufax. I mean, we're talking about this played out on the scope of a billion, but there's this really conflictual thing that happens in our brain, and so if we can help people strengthen the brain cells to maybe make a different choice, then we really help it out. So, you know, that just really kind of helped me understand that there's almost this conflict going on, even at our neuron level, at that basic level, almost microscopic quantum level in our brain. I had to say quantum for Stephen Hawking's. That guy had so much influence on me. He was talking about black holes, not necessarily neurons, but yeah, I'll miss that guy. I think I read pretty much every one of his books. I couldn't understand.
You lost, Matt. You lost.
But Stephen, man, I'll miss you. You wrote things for me, which I appreciate. I couldn't understand a paper you ever wrote.
Oh, did you just make a conscious choice to change?
Yeah, we lost him.
That was pre-wired. That should not surprise any of the audience or you two especially. You knew you had to have known that was coming out. I was trying to find it, but you know, the vote was like 90 to 10. So to get us back on track, and because I could go into action potential, but that would just disrail us totally. What do you think? As a lot of the folks we work with are so programmed, whether it's a behavior we see in the classroom, whether it's something like addiction, a parenting style, which seems really ingrained, a relationship attachment template. Kurt, let me start out with you from the behavioralist sort of perspective. How do we help people start to consider a different behavior? How do we get people to start to consider that, hey, maybe today let's come down Broadway and not Koufax?
Sure. I'm thinking of Dan Siegel's book, No Drama Discipline. Mm-hmm. And to oversimplify, as we kind of have to do, he talks a lot about that when we get stressed, the way that our brain works, and I would argue that our behavior does the same thing, it goes towards rigidity or chaos. Right? There's probably, you could put freeze in there too, right? You could go inaction in there as well. But that's kind of where I go to, right? When I'm talking to somebody and they're talking to me about whether they want to change or they don't want to change. Most of the time they come because they want to change and then fight you every step of the way. They're going to kind of one of those two places. If they're stressed out, they go to very, very rigid. I need to do the same thing I did next time. I can't look at any other option. Or they're going to complete chaos, and it's hard to make a decision when you have so many options out. I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. So I kind of watch for those two things. And that's motivational interviewing, really. You know, it's you're listening for verbal statements about change. And when you start to hear verbal statements about change, you start to reinforce those statements, and you start to like talk a little bit more about that. Tell me how you're thinking about that. What would that be like? And ask more questions related to change talk. So that's kind of what I was thinking while you were talking. I was thinking a lot about that kind of two ends of a spectrum of going towards rigidity or going towards chaos. Mm-hmm. And either one kind of gives you, as a helper, some ideas about where do I need to go? Like if they're going towards chaos, where do I need to go? If they're going towards rigidity, what do I need to do? Yeah. But you're really taking what you're getting from that individual in the environment and adjusting your intervention and your action to match up with what that person needs in that moment, which is pretty good attunement, I think.
Yeah, so helping people kind of sit with that plasticity or flexibility that you talked about earlier, and that's where change rarely happens in the rigidity or chaos. Though those are more the reactive lower levels of the brain. But how do we create and relate with people in a way to help them regulate or regulate and then relate, depending on where the individual
Right.
walks in,
Right.
so we can take advantage of that plastic nature of the brain, which is the really cool thing is that the brain is constantly changing. So there is really hope for everybody, even if you've walked down Koufax for the last 20 years of your life. So, I mean, that's the really exciting thing
Right.
about this.
Tomorrow's another flip of the coin. You get another shot.
Exactly. And to realize you're flipping the coin, that was such the insight that I finally got is like, hey, you can flip the coin. And you know, that a lot of people don't realize that there is another option out there because they're in that survival mode, which is,
You know, Jerry used to say to me a lot when I was first supervising a lot of clinical staff, and I would struggle with it. You know, I would struggle with those days. And one of the things that I appreciated most is that Jerry would listen to me just like, I'm sure, kvetch about it, you know. And he would look at it and I'd be like, oh, I think I screwed that up so bad. And he would go, the good thing is they're going to give you another chance to do it right. Maybe you get it right next time. They give you an opportunity.
well, and without that acceptance and compassion, I mean, there's a lot of data to back us up. Change doesn't happen. There was a really good meta study done of studies. So studies about what's the number one predictor of a successful change being made. And the number one predictor was that the person working with you, the teacher, the therapist, believed in your ability to actually make that change. And I'm like, ooh, you know, you kind of got that without the relationship. You weren't going to have the regulation to really get that plasticity on board. But
that scratched your existential itch, didn't it?
Exactly. It's hard to judge the individual because, again, like you said, there's that environment and the relationships around them. Jerry, what about some of your thoughts on what we can do to really help people with a trauma history really start the change process to find power in their own world?
You know, as you were talking, as Kurt was talking, the word that popped into my mind was states. The capacity to volitionally manage your states. Right. And I think that, motivational interviewing is a technique. And the technique, I think what it does is it allows the person listening to help to regulate the state of the person they're listening to. And that really what you want to do is help the individual get into a state that they do have choice. Going back to this concept that we started out of, in one time we can make a choice and in other times we're on automatic. And how do I, for individuals who feel like they don't have the ability to regulate their state, how do I show up and be present with them? How do I attune to them? How do I resonate with them enough in a way that they could borrow my capacities? But ultimately what I'm trying to do is regulate their states so that they can then, one is have a vision of the future where they feel hopeful that something could be different. And two is begin to weigh out options. And really the state that usually your clients come to you in is not the state that is accessible to. So that we as helpers have to support our clients getting into the state that they need to get into to be able to see that they do have choice and they can make some difference. And, sometimes giving people choice, they don't always choose what we want. And recognizing that too and honoring them for them too, is that, you know what, you had a choice to go one way or the other way and you chose to go that way. Let me try to understand why you chose that today, as opposed to you made the wrong choice, So a lot of it, even from, when we're little children, we have very little ability to regulate our own states. Mm-hmm. And for some people, because of the conditions they live in, they lose the capacity to regulate states. And the regulation of states, I believe, is what gives us choice. When we're, as Daniel Siegel, Vanderkult, Dr. Perry talks about, when we're integrated and when we're able to regulate those states, we can use those top parts of our brain that make us so uniquely human that allow us to have volitional decision. When we're in a state of fear, anxiety, or in some ways that survival is present, we lose the capacity to kind of think about and make a decision that will benefit. So really, whether you're using motivational interviewing, whether you're doing some type of attachment work, whether you're doing some trauma work, really what you're trying to give the person is the capacity to manage the states that they're in, and that to kind of in the state that allows them to kind of maximize this, whether it's neuroplasticity, the self-organizing processes of the brain, but to begin to integrate information, sensations, feelings, thoughts, and then make some choice about how they want to behave.
Great. And so let's kind of come to a conclusion here. So would we agree that an individual, given the right, I'm just going to put support through relationships, has the ability to enact volition in certain circumstances? Is that a agree? Would we all agree to that?
Kurt?
Huh.
I didn't even throw out free will. I was just going
to
volition under certain circumstances.
Due to time, you got to answer in the form of a question.
Yeah,
I think yes, and with this qualifier. To the extent to which that relationship and that history helps them to be in a state that allows for maximal flexibility and awareness of the current environment.
Awesome. So just to round this out, I think we're all on at least in the same book, which I didn't know we get there or not. So really cool. And just to go back to that real concrete study, when we see what really drives outcomes in services, I always go back to this because I think whether we're talking about healing or change, I think it goes, you know that long established study that 40% of the outcomes are what the client's characteristics, and I think that speaks a lot to the history, the struggles that somebody's gone through, and then it's the quality of relationship is 30%. Hope is 15, and then our techniques are 15 as well. And I think, really just helps really show whatever study we look at in trauma or in behavioral change, that the relationship just plays such a critical factor. And I would also put in there safety. As I say, if you want somebody to pay attention to their addiction, we need to give them a safe place to live first. It's hard to have somebody, if you're just always in survival and you don't know if you've got a place to sleep or not, I might choose to go get high if I was dealing with that kind of stress. Hopefully I would make a good choice and go to the library, take a class, get some resources. But, I think we do what we do to survive. And like I said, driven by that lower brain. So again, I think our support and just really, again, connecting with people to help them contemplate and not try to force them into action, really critical part of it. And,
Matt,
yeah.
to end today, the human nervous system and way of being in the world, it's a complex system, which means that you cannot understand the whole by examining each of the individual parts, because the whole is made up of way more than the individual parts. So when we try to break it up to let's look at the behavior and what's responding to it, when we look at what part of the brain is responding, each of these individual parts cannot explain the whole. And so when we're dealing with an individual in front of us, we can't break up each of the individual parts and say we understand the whole. We have to really understand the person that's right in front of us to be able to understand why they made the decisions or didn't make the decisions that they did, to kind of look at that piece. So I think that, what's a good relationship for me is not a good relationship. So really, we've got to, it's so complex, which allows us to have at least 8 more podcasts to kind of do this topic, to kind of look at that piece. But, the whole is way greater than the sum of any one of its parts. So the wish is, if we just understood each of these parts, we can figure out and have control of it. But we're way more complex than that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I love Daniel Siegel, which was my sort of way to think about the mind from a scientific perspective. And it just resonates with what Kurt says about inside the skin and outside the skin. When he defines the human mind, which in his argument can help restructure the physical aspects of the brain, like we've talked a lot about, he not only puts our biology and our physiological in there, but also our environment and relationships as well. So he even sees that some, kind of like what you're saying, Jerry, is not just inside ourselves, but also outside, where I think, Kurt, you're helping me to kind of define things in that way has really been helpful with all our talks as well.
I think that's one of the most valuable things that I have found about a trauma-informed approach, is it really is integrating what we know about all of those things and doing it in a way where we can all start to talk to each other. I think for me, that's one of the real values of the movement, as they say.
It is the movement. and to just sort of wrap up today, because I think if we were to push this to, we could literally talk, I know the 3 of us, for hours, but I think if we would have pushed it maybe even 20 more minutes, we would have really dove in to the concept of mindfulness, because of the importance of regulating the lower parts of the nervous system before we get to that rational aspect. Oh, there's Jerry's therapy dog.
Don't we have an episode about mindfulness coming up or something?
We do. Good to say that. My good friend and mindfulness guru in Southern California, Melissa Springstead, is joining us for next week's episode. I've been exposed to her work a couple times and been really impressed with her. So again, something we haven't gotten to in a whole lot of this episode. We'll pick up big time next episode. So Melissa's great. So stay tuned for that. And Kurt and Jerry, I just want to thank you. In memory of Stephen Hawkins, I did write some blog posts a few years ago about how to explain the mind and the phenomena of the mind through quantum physics. So I will stick a link to that for maybe the one person that might be interested in it. But I'll throw it up there. I did this whole training on the quantum physics of motivational interviewing at a conference. They obviously liked me a lot to let me do that one at a workshop. But I'll throw that up there just for Stephen Hawkins. And again, if you're interested in marching, the March for Our Lives this Saturday, we've talked a lot about the gun issue and safety in our community. And if you want to support those kids and that cause, another movement that's going on Saturday. And if you're in the Denver area, come join us and march with us. So thank you, Kurt and Jerry, and we will see you next week, where we'll look at mindfulness and its role in helping heal trauma. And again, I imagine the change issue will come up as well. So thank you, guys.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matt.
Everybody have a great week.